Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit.
Beautifuls, you're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're having conversations about the awakening spiritual path, and what does that even mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? The beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. Today we're talking about what I guess we could call living from truth. I had an experience not that long back with a mentor of mine who was asking me exactly what do you want? Exactly what do you want? And I noticed a freeze response. And this opened up for me a new depth of experience around what it really can feel like to live from truth. Truth as opposed to following the momentum of past conditioning and habits. Many of us say we want to be authentic or know our true nature or the truth of reality, but what does that look like or really mean? We're kicking off the conversation by getting into some teachings from Adyashanti, and of course, as always, we're diving into our experiences and challenges and stepping into greater alignment with our own inner truth. If you're enjoying the show, you can definitely help support us. You can come hang out with us on social media and chat with us. It's Bliss and Grit on Facebook, and on Instagram, we're at Bliss and Grit Podcast. You can also head over to our Patreon site to help support us financially. We've chosen not to have advertisers on the show right now, so it's one way that we can help provide these episodes that we do hope uplift your world. You can find that information on our website, which is blissandgrit.com. You can also head over to the website to sign up for our weekly digest or to find out more about the private practices that both Brooke and I have. One last thing before we head into conversation. On occasion, Brooke and I can curse. I don't think we did in this episode, but if you are in mixed company, you may want to pop in some headphones. Okay, everyone, here we go. Hello, Brooke.
Hello there.
Well, it's been a while because even though we recorded last week, this is our first time recording alone in, I don't know, 7 weeks?
Yeah,
something like that.
A really long time. Yeah, it's like a long overdue hangout, even though we've talked and actually hung out in between, but
yeah, I know. Let's see how rusty we are.
Let's, especially considering we're both feeling a little under the weather. So it's all perfect. It's all perfectly designed.
Well, hi, y'all. It's so nice to reconnect again. And today, what we want to talk about is living from truth. And that's just one very shortcut way to say it. We'll get into it a little bit deeper as we go. But maybe the easiest way is for me to start with a story as to why this feels relevant so we can speak about it from that experiential lens that we love so much. So, I guess a few months back now, I had an experience. I was speaking to a mentor of mine, and I was at a crossroads. I had to make a decision about something, and my mentor was like, well, what do you want to do? Now, that sounds like an awfully simple question, right? But what I was confronted with in that moment, as I really kind of froze in my tracks, is like, as they were asking me with that level of intensity, like, what do you want? I could feel a freeze. And I could almost immediately understand what was difficult for me. There was what the good person in me should want, There was what should I want? Like what's the right thing to want? And then there was the simple truth of what I wanted. And I did get that out of my mouth afterwards, to which my hilarious mentor said, alas, the truth, and had me giggle. But it was a really powerful moment for me. And I think what was so powerful was to notice that pause and to notice how I almost couldn't get the words out of my mouth. And I think on other episodes, Brooke, we've spoken about when you don't even know what you want, like when you hit the limits of your own imagination of possibility and potentiality. This was different. I knew what I wanted, but there was a challenge to admit it, right? The challenge was in the owning and the expression of it. I don't even know if I had fully owned it to myself, but certainly to express it out loud. And what came of that circumstance was once I had executed what I really wanted, what was true for me, even though it was challenging, even though it challenged my identity structures, it challenged my thoughts about what a good person would want, and so on and so forth, I felt incredibly free. Almost like, I don't know, a new flow of energy was coming into my being. And it was the first time I really got clear, like, wow, aligning with truth brings energy. So it got me thinking back to, when did we go see Adyashanti that summer in Ithaca? Was that last year or the year before?
The year before, because this summer our only real get-together was New Jersey, so it was the year before. Yeah?
Well,
2 years
when
before?
we went to see Adyashanti, I don't even know. I'm like, wait, so was that... We went to see Adyashanti a little bit back in Ithaca, and he was talking about spiritual autonomy, and the whole talk was about truth and living from truth and embodying truth in your life. And he said, so many people, I'm going to paraphrase this, and I'm sure a little off, but you'll get the essence of it. He was talking about how so many people, they want authenticity. They want to know the truth. They want to live what's true for them. They want to know their true self, right? There's all these different ways that we yearn for or express that we want truth. And he was saying, what I tell people is you want to know the quickest way to live a life that's based in truth? Tell the truth. Be honest. And I was like, what? No. I mean, I think it stood out in my mind because my small self personality structure has always been wired to not be confrontational. Or that's funny. People who know me would not agree with that. There's some truth and there's not. Sometimes I've mistakenly been confrontational, but when I can think about it, it's always been wired not to hurt people's feelings with what may be hard information or what may be hard choices. And so when he said that, I was like, so just tell the truth? And you think to yourself, how could that really mean I'd be aligned with truth to tell the truth? Like, is it as simple as that? But when I had this experience, and I've had others since, and I've worked with some clients in the same domain, it started to clarify for me that the living path, right? Our lives are our paths. Our lives are what is giving us the information and opportunity to see where we're still hooked by our conditioning and then let it go so we can evolve into new states of consciousness and understanding. The living path is going to present you with all of these crossroads. And it's going to say, beloved, can you choose the truth now? How about now? And I think we can talk more about the ego itself or the protective personality and how it got set up to move away from truth. But I just thought it was really a fascinating thing to talk about.
Yeah. And I've been up against that plenty, but in recent history. And What comes to mind, because there's so many avenues we can take with this, one of the things that comes to mind that's like a misunderstanding about what the spiritual path is, like your definition that you just spoke of the living path is so succinct and powerful and right on. And what I've seen when it comes to turning away from the truth is that often there can be an idea that the spiritual path is about better tolerating literally everything and not being triggered by literally anything. And I've seen this so commonly, so we can see how that would send us down one particular fork in the road away from truth. And actually, if we go to the far reaches of that, there's ways that we're putting ourselves in harm's way, even if it's emotionally in harm's way, right? Like, I don't like being around this person, but they really like being around me. So I'm going to keep hanging out with this person, because a spiritual person would be able to tolerate what it is that annoys me or whatever. And so what you're describing is a very nice, precise clarification that we're talking about for any individual human being with the actual life circumstances that they're presented in any given moment, what is true for them in that moment. And that it takes a tremendous amount of courage, because what we're doing is going against our conditioning, and we're going against our egos, especially for those of us who have a ton of conditioning about, like you were saying, not hurting people's feelings, being liked. And we're culturally, like the United States has like a huge hang up with being liked. That's why celebrity culture is so huge here. It's one of the reasons. Not hurting people's feelings, being liked. And for those of us who are on a spiritual path, or we would describe ourselves that way, being the good one. And then what is the conditioned idea of what the good one is? The good one never gets emotionally triggered, so can just be in the wind tunnel of anything or can tolerate anything. And that's what compassion is. So they can just let themselves be exposed to things that in truth they would prefer not to be exposed to.
In some circles, they would call what you're describing the spiritual superego. And it's funny, I don't think I would have conceptualized of myself as someone who had a spiritual superego being active. But in that moment, I could see like the little bits of it, because, I was already a fawner by nature, a people pleaser by nature. And by nature, I really mean by small self design.
By conditioning.
And then I went and I studied a lot of Buddhism, and I followed a lot of teachings, and you get all that messaging, right? Compassion, forgiveness, tolerance, acceptance.
Yeah, breathe in the suffering of others. All that Tonglen kind of can get misinterpreted in this way.
Right. And then my small self can take these things that are valuable teachings on states of consciousness and being, and turn it into, I'm supposed to just martyr myself.
Yeah.
Right. And I guess let's talk about how this works. I have like my mind's going in two different directions, but let's talk about how it forms a little bit, because what we can see is when we do something that's not true for us, let's say stay at the job that we really despise because we think we should, or stay in a relationship that's not healthy for us or not desired by us because we want to be a good person or we want to help someone, whatever it is. Whenever we do something that's not true for us, what I've noticed is we have free will to do that, but there are consequences to it. Life gets more complicated. Your energy levels get affected. Your health gets affected. Your nervous system gets affected. Yet if many of us are honest, there's probably two phases. There's a phase where we're so asleep to our conditioning, we don't even see it. If we're asleep enough to our conditioning and we don't see it, there is no choice.
Right.
There is no choice.
Operating out of the deep unconscious habits that were handed to us.
Yeah.
By other people's
the patterns
deep unconscious
are just
habits.
driving the bus and we don't realize it. But then if we wake up enough to say, hey, something's going on here, there's some pattern that's running, then we start to have a choice. We can choose to do what is the most aligned choice, the truthiest truth we can find at the moment, or we can choose to uphold whatever feels right, quote unquote, easy, appropriate, spiritual. But when we don't choose what's honestly true, we see consequences. So then why isn't this easier? Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, if you think about the fact that consciousness was always enlightened, consciousness was always awake, I don't know exactly why we come into this body, but my sense is we're coming here, and part of the game of life is its consciousness knowing itself and waking up to itself. Why isn't this easier? Why is living from truth so complex? And so there's a lot of reasons for that. But you know, one of the things I was thinking about in looking at this with my clients was when I think about the protective personality or the small self or the ego, whatever we want to call it, I think about it's a safety strategy, right? It's a safety strategy born out of separation consciousness.
Yeah.
So I have to protect myself because myself is separate than you. And what are we protecting then? Like, what is the strategy? So almost always, I think, and this is something I'm thinking about sort of in real time, but I think that we get the message that to be true to ourselves would incur a cost.
Yeah.
And that's not 100% across the board. Maybe if you have a really good sense of humor, you're allowed to laugh liberally in your life. There's no danger around that. But in some way, shape, or form, we get the message that if we were honest about our feelings, or if we honestly articulated our needs, or if we were who we were, you know, opinionated, loud, funny, brash, confident, whatever that was, if we were who we were, something that we don't want to happen would happen. There would be some unsafe consequence, whether it's physical or emotional. So then I realized, like, wow, almost like if you look at it from a kind of global perspective, the whole strategy of the small self is don't be true.
Don't be true, and I'm also pondering this in real time, don't be true if it goes against your conditioned programming. So if we can
don't be true if truth in whatever way that is the case would create perceived harm. Right. So like I said, like you can laugh if laughing's accepted in your family of origin. You can pitch a fit if pitching fits are accepted in your, but if saying what you need isn't welcomed in your, then
and we can see
you will
that's
learn.
Rare, you know, culturally rare. If you can imagine some fantasy family unit where everyone had all of Brene Brown's work hooked to their veins from a young age. And it was like, this is how you're true. And this is how you're vulnerable, but also while standing in yourself and not flinging it at other people. If that was the norm, like if we can imagine a very healthy family unit by way of imagining a very healthy culture, then being true wouldn't be so threatening. It would just be what we do. But that's not what's going on. So it has to hit up against some perceived survival threat in the nervous system, because these are the things that we got without choosing them when we were at an age when we couldn't choose them. So somewhere in the, if we want to be real classical about it, somewhere in the 0 to 3 range, you know, ego structure is, I mean, it happens before then, but that's when it's all getting real deep wired in. You're taught, right? Like, taught oftentimes by body language and behavior, don't cry, it makes mom upset. All right. So I can't have needs much of the time because mom responds by losing her shit or shutting down, and I don't like it. So, okay, don't have needs. And that has to be because we're so vulnerable at those ages, and our brain maturity and our consciousness maturity is, I think, once I say consciousness, I don't know for sure, but pretty young. There's a lot of how do I, right? I show up as an infant. I was in the womb. The womb is just like pure unity consciousness, right? Now I'm this person and I get hungry and I need to pee and I need to poo and there's these other people. And we gradually over time learn like oh my God, I'm a separate person. How do the separate people seem to get through life? And then we mirror the people around us. So naturally, at a time when we were so vulnerable and we didn't have the adult awareness or the adult agency that we have now, right? Like if your parents are a complete shit show and you're 18 months old, sorry, like what are you going to do? Get an apartment across town? No. So you have to find ways to manage the environment. And that management feels, rightly so, like a matter of actual survival. How do we get through these human life things when I'm in this body? Oh, like that, where we rage at people and then they do what we want, or we shut down and always appease people and then we get our way, or we're seen as the good ones. There's a secondary gain, whatever it might be. So it's fun sometimes to at least bring in the ideal. If there were a world where people really understood this, we would all just be like, this is true, and this is true, and this is true, because we would believe in the flow of life, not having errors, just being the life that we have, that it's living through us. And so we don't know why, it's a mystery, but we're here to have certain kinds of experiences. Oh, right now it's saying no thank you to somebody who you don't like being with. Look at that. That's what showed up today. And you just live that one out.
I remember in Adya's talk, he was talking about Jesus Christ. I think mostly Jesus because he wrote that book about Jesus.
Resurrecting Jesus, yeah. Yeah,
he really enjoys that character and that story. And he was talking about, if you've ever read the Bible, like this guy is not a tame guy. He's very much got a personality. He's got opinions. He takes stands. Like, he's not just Mr. I accept everything. And that's just an interesting thing to remember. Yes. I just want to say that as a side note. If we think about idealism, if we were to be welcomed for what's true, if the whole consciousness of the world could wake up to say it's all meant to be as it is, then we would understand that who we are is meant to be as we are.
Right. Including our preferences, our feelings.
Including our preferences. Why else would they be there? I mean, preferences can be conditioned.
For sure. There's lots of preferences that are conditioned.
Lots of conditioned preferences. We could say that, therefore, that desires would be possibly conditioned. But if we start to get close to the truthiest truth, like as we start to go through this deeper introspection to like, but this is what I really want. Mm-hmm. Right? I've really sat with it and this is what I want. Then we imagine that's there for a reason. Mm-hmm. That it's just how you do things, right? It's youing. And, right now we have a very funny civilization. Like even if a parent was super hip and cool and open and aware, then you still go to school, then you still watch TV, then they still may tell you don't scream in front of strangers because, kids are wild little beasts, right? So I'm sure on some level we would get conditioned, but I think depending on the kinds of traumas you've been through, developmental or other, you can get conditioned farther away from understanding and listening to and acting from a place of alignment. And you can get conditioned into these patterns of self-doubt. I mean, of course we could say unworthiness, and that's definitely one of the patterns we can get conditioned into. And then along with unworthiness comes this self-doubt thing. You ever notice that? It's like you kind of know what you want, but then the doubt says, should you want that? Is that right? You messed up before. What makes you think you should want this? My friends say, right? You know how many times you listen to someone and they're like, but my friends have said, and well, they're not you.
Yeah.
Right. And life and all its majesty is coming through you. So it's a really interesting thing. I was kind of laughing on the inside as we started talking, because I'm like, oh, we're talking about trust your life in a certain regard. Only, of course, part of what we're saying is you are life.
Yeah.
And that there's this relationship of trust we're repairing with ourselves. And that if we want to be in our truth and living a life that's more aligned than before, more true than before, we don't have to go some black and white goal, but just closer than before.
Yeah.
That we are going against the patterns that said love exists when you do this and safety exists when you do this. And this is what spiritual people do. And this is what good adults do, et cetera, which obviously is not that easy for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I want to loop back to what you were talking about, because you mentioned the amount when you spoke what you wanted. You said there was this tremendous energy freed up. And I know the energy of which you speak in myself, but I'm curious, did that happen just from articulating for yourself, this is what I want? Or did it happen after you took whatever the action was, where you had to convey what it is that you want?
You know, it's a great question. I think, you know, and now I'm reflecting back and, you know, my memory can be a little spotty, but I think what happened was the energy was there almost immediately after. Mm-hmm. And I think what happened was the truth was seen so clearly that it was as if the action had already taken place.
Yeah.
Like I knew once this was admitted and seen, the rest was inevitable.
Yeah, it was like 95% complete.
Right. And then when I took the action, now that was edgy.
Right. Yeah, that's a little bit what I want to talk about, the energy, because I think that's important, that frees up. But I also want to talk about the moment of having to take the action.
Yeah, it was edgy. You know, I was scared. I think that's useful to note. Like, that's part of why we're fleshing this out, right? Is ultimately, seems to me, we have to choose according to truth if we're on an awakening path, mm-hmm. if we're looking for alignment, if we want to know the universe as us. We have to ultimately choose consciously rather than let the programs, the patterns dictate us, right? But that means it's scary. Because that means you're going outside. Like, it's almost like someone, like you grew up in this like small town and there were always signs like danger, don't cross this path, right? And then we're going in the outside land, exactly where we've learned all of our lives, like, do not pass these signs.
Yes.
So I was scared. It was a little edgy. I had moments where I had to tolerate guilt, moments where I had to tolerate shame. I did some healing work to go back to the young one in me that that first felt it had to sacrifice itself so that someone else wouldn't have their feelings hurt. And I did that. But ultimately, having taken the action pretty quick with it, once I got through the fear and I did it, back came the energy, mm-hmm. like full throttle. And I've seen that a few times now where it's like, whoa, turns out living more and more from your truth is more and more alive, mm-hmm. right? It opens up more and more flow and aliveness. I think that's the best way I could describe it for now.
I have a great audio quote that you wrote in your notes from when we saw him. When you're in truth, it feels good. Even if it's scary, you can feel scared and good at the same time. I might make a poster out of you can feel scared and good at the same time. Because there is, when you know that there's a big truth sitting there, which means that there's going to have to be something relational that happens, right? Like you're going to have to articulate it to another person, or you're going to have to make a big change, move, whatever it is that you know. It's really scary. And it feels so freeing, like an actual physical, and it is an actual physical constrictions, let go. And it's like, life force can move through. And one of the reasons why I want to kind of touch on this, because it's like, okay, there's the program that says don't articulate your truth. And then there's the pressure inside that says there's a truth here that you're going to have to experience and say out loud. And then it's articulated for yourself. What do I actually want? And there's this huge flood of energy. And whatever it is that needs to happen in your practical life happens. You have the hard conversation, you make the plan to move or leave your job, whatever it is. And then there's just this like, and what you experience is that if it's really from truth and not the ego hijacking a sensation that feels like truth, which we can talk about, then actually tons of good stuff opens up. And I'm not trying to be Pollyanna about this, but in my experience, it's like, yeah, things start to flow. People might be upset and not agree with your truth, but my experience is that in my life, something good's going to happen. And that reality testing, like the more I do it, I just have more experiences of, look, this is not logically what my preference would be. Logically, my preference would be to just keep on keeping on the way things are. But it seems like there's a truth here pushing on me. What do I actually want? And then I articulate it, and I can trust more and more. This really is, this isn't an idea about what the highest good is. I'm going to now see evidence of the highest good. And not just for me. Sometimes with deeply unconscious people, the highest good doesn't feel good because it's basically shaking a sleepwalking person and going, wake up. And not everyone wants to come out of sleepwalking. Fine. It's not about them. But I would still put that under the header of highest good. Not that we're fixing them, but just like, well, this is the story of my life. This is what's true for me. And since it interacts with theirs, this seems to be the story of their life too. That I articulate this truth.
Well, you're stepping out of separation consciousness.
Right.
And so there's this imagination like, we were both put here together for a reason. And you get your side of it, right? Like we're not trying to figure out for the other person why they're there and what they've got to learn or gain or be invited to. I know this may come off as sounding callous or insensitive, but I think everyone knows me well enough to know that's not really what I'm operating from. But what I kind of got in that moment was I spent so much time in my life worrying about if I hurt someone's feelings or upset them or did wrong by them or, all those kinds of things that a conflict avoidant, people-pleasing structure could do, right? And like, what good did that do? Honestly.
Yeah.
Like, were my relationships better? No, I was usually like exhausted or resentful or, in some kind of contorted pattern because I didn't want to be there. Right. So if you feel like you have to be somewhere where you don't want to be, then you feel a victim of that circumstance. So you don't usually feel great about it. I don't know what they were getting out of it or not, but like, did they actually, like, did I change their lives by doing something I didn't want to do for the better? I don't think really I did. And so what I started to realize is I can't know what's best for anyone else. I really can't. Not just because no one can know, but, like that's for God's path, right? Mm-hmm. We're all here for these beautiful, mysterious purposes. And if we're blessed, we get to know it better in our own life, but I don't know someone else's. So then I was like, but if I could feel so much better by being honest, and obviously kindly honest, compassionately honest, thoughtfully honest, lovingly honest, which I did, but then maybe that's the only evidence I can have of experience, right? Like we've always followed the direct path, you and I. Every teacher we've drawn to is like the direct path, which is the experiential path. Like get right in there, have the experience and inquire. And if I felt better, then I have to assume this is the only experience I can know. So it's good. Thumbs up.
Right. Yeah. You only get to pilot your experience, and that we have to keep remembering, because the habit of duality is to always forget that there is the mystery. There's something else other than my ideas about what I should do or what's best for another person or the pro and con list about the best job or location or whatever. And so there is this fundamental trust in like, let's invite the mystery to the party and say, I don't know. All I know is what I'm actually feeling and experiencing. And it's probably worth mentioning, as you mentioned at the beginning, but just touching on it a little more, that like, yes, are we all emerging out of unconsciousness? Definitely. So is it murky sometimes? Is it confusing? Do we sometimes go down a path that we thought felt like truth, and it turns out it was just a common one is lust or an addiction to excitement or a habit that we need to like tear it all down and start anew? Sure. Like, we're human beings. Do we bungle it? Do we get turned around? And this is where it is just a bit by bit experience. And then we start to get much more familiar with what this process feels like. When something is internally is like, I'm gonna keep at it until I get your attention, you're not getting out of. And what I find is the more true I get, the more I can't get away with being even a little bit not true. Am I still full of shit sometimes? Definitely. Does my conditioning still run me? Plenty. But it only has so much runway until truth starts going like, really?
Well, the consequences start to become apparent. We just keep pushing them away. Like, no, thank you.
Yes.
I don't want to know this. I know. Did you see in those notes I sent when Adyashanti was talking about how the body becomes the truth instrument too, that even as your consciousness is aligning with devotion to truth, so is your body. And so the body becomes a learning instrument over truth. So it starts to tell you when you're doing things that aren't true. Now, again, as you said, that's why it's a living path, right? Like, it will come to us through life. We will misread signals. We are human. We do have blind spots. That's kind of what conditioning does. It creates giant blind spots, the biggest to our divinity.
Yeah.
Right? But, you know, many, many blind spots. And so it will be like a path. We'll have to be an observation of ourselves and willing to make mistakes and then willing to understand this is all part of the human journey. But, you know, I was just reading this book, I don't know, maybe today or yesterday, and they were talking about how we all, I don't know about you all, but you're listening to us, so probably, but many people want truth. They want alignment. They want to feel in the flow of life, connected to source, connected to the universe, all of these beautiful things. And life will respond by showing you exactly where you're still hooked, right? This is like Matt Kahn's teaching too.
Assignments.
Plenty of assignments. And it comes in your life. So it will be like, oh, okay, honey, you want to get free? Okay, well, here are the blind spots that still exist where the small self is still driving the bus. Here it is. And then I remember when this happened to me. So just to use this one example where I was at a crossroads and it was a personal relationship. I was feeling, you know, really put out that this was coming my way at the time.
Yeah, that's
like,
my experience too, when I don't feel like listening to the nudge internally.
Yeah, like, not this again, and why is this happening kind of a feeling. And that was very semi-conscious. I didn't catch what my psyche was doing with it really in real time. So I sat down and I got a tarot card reading. And the person reading my tarot card said something to me like, you're stuck in victim consciousness. Like, this thing is coming to you for you, you know, not against you. It's not happening to you. It's coming for you. And it's like, oh my God, how did I not see that? Right? Like, here it is again. But, you know, in each area of your life where you have blind spots, you know, you can go through this process all over again. It just seems like it gets more refined and easier when you've done it in a couple of categories. And as soon as I saw that, because I'm very open to that wisdom, I was like, oh, yes, this is happening for me. And if it's happening for me, then I know the pattern I'm healing here. Like, right. This is not really complicated. And I know what's hard for me, but I know what is in the highest good for this being named Vanessa. And that gave me even more energy to stay committed to the path I had chosen already and like kind of wake up out of it. And when that arises, I mean, I guess that arises at first on a cognitive level, and then it becomes more of a living realization. But when you do start to trust life and you realize you are life, so your consciousness is participating in the creation of reality, and you realize, well, everything's coming to me as an invitation. It's like Matt's whole book, Everything is Here to Help You.
Yeah.
Was basically about that. Sorry, Matt Kahn. That really shifted. And it lets me not be so down on anyone. Because before that, when I was caught in that level of victim consciousness, you're vacillating. I was vacillating between judging the other me, right? Someone's wrong. Something's wrong. Something's going wrong, right? And once you free yourself and you see this is just a beautiful invitation to healing, I could say, oh, you know what? I'm human. There's areas that I have blind spots to. Now I see. Now I know. And now I can take deep breaths and find the courage and capacity to do the thing that my small self was trained out of doing for the highest good of myself. And according to unity consciousness, the highest good of everyone involved. And I believe that's true, and I sure hope it is. Whether it looked like that right on the spot or it becomes that 10 years later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's something we're circling here too a little bit, which is that we're describing an incremental lived process, like feet on the ground, one foot in front of the other. This experience shows up, and gradually over time you learn how to say like, yes, thank you, life. Another assignment that's going to feel uncomfortable at first, but definitely bring me deeper healing because I can see that this is all familiar turf for this one's life, right? And this is something that we keep mentioning him, but Matt Kahn spoke about recently too. I can't remember which talk, but I will for sure look for it and put it in the show notes if it's on YouTube and maybe in one of his private classes. But talking about like there's this giant piece, he didn't put it this way, but of cultural conditioning that we should be able to do things instantaneously, that we should be able to get it all at once. And that is really just cultural conditioning that says, well, okay, well, how do I just let go of all of my shame all at once and never experience it again? Or like, okay, well, how do I just, 100% of the time live in the flow of my truth and perfectly articulate the flow of my truth? In my experience, that's just not the way it goes. I believe that it might go that way for some people. I don't know. But we're talking about the human path, right? So just to say, if there's this feeling of like, well, how do I get rid of this 100% right away? The perk that I have found, because certainly I went through that frustration as well. And the frustration only went away when I realized that these things coming to me, like for what we're talking about, a truth that needs to be spoken so that greater alignment and healing can come through. Having it happen in this slow one step, another step, oh, here comes another assignment, oh, here comes another one, is just actually really, really, really satisfying. And I have a suspicion that that's what we're here for, is to not to be constantly healing, but to enjoy our lives, and that there's something really satisfying. That if I'm piloting the one called Brooke for this lifetime, and we're in partnership, we are life, and she has certain experiences and DNA, right? That it's really, really satisfying to be able to experience this life from this point of view. Consciousness gets to be in a body and have this point of view. Life gets to be embodied. And to do this in a way where we're asked to get so intimate with what it feels like to acknowledge the truth of something and then have fresh energy wash through, and then life shifts. And then like, oh, here comes this deeper teaching or this deeply satisfying experience of what it feels like to live on the other side of articulating that truth, that's just really satisfying and not something to be turned away from, the slowness of the process. Like I remember, because I grew up with some neurological and physical stuff, and it was when I was like 30, you and I were living in the Brooklyn area, and I was going to Brooklyn Yoga Studio. I had talked myself into finally going to yoga. One of my challenges was hypertonicity, so I had very, very, very short hypertonic hamstrings, couldn't really bend forward to touch my knees. So needless to say, yoga studio, very intimidating. And I did a private with the owner, and because I was so embarrassed because I didn't want to show my body and its limitations in a group class. And he was like, "Oh, so how long have you been working on rehabilitating this pattern?" And at that time, it was 7 or 8 years. So I said, 7, 8 or 8 years. And he said, "Oh, it's so great." And I was like, "What do you mean it's so great?" Like I felt like I had fallen down to the job. And he's like, "Well, what else are you going to do?"
Jonathan.
Jonathan Fitzgordon, for those who are wondering. Like, it seems to be what's on your plate. How cool that you get to be so devoted to your physical rehabilitation. Because otherwise you're just going to either decide that it's, untenable or that you're the worst. Instead, it could just be like, "Oh, great. I'm 7 or 8 years into like thinking about maybe moving and not being embarrassed that I move differently in group movement classes." Great.
Well, you said that was beautiful, and you said so many things. I had about 20 different thoughts explode in my head at once. I should write them down as like future topics, but let's see which one wants to get through the most. I think I like that you mentioned how good it can feel. And, it's funny sometimes because this is how the small self works. It's like, I'm going to play this game called Do What Life's Asking Me, because then I want to kick back and manifest some good shit, right?
Right. I'm going to get an A on all of the tests. And then
I'll take a good breather and I'm going to go on psychic vacation and be in that good place. And the funny thing is, the more devoted you are to truth, it comes faster and faster. Yep. It just comes gentler and gentler. Like it's not, a gale force wind. Right. It's a delightful
Consciousness
breeze.
Doesn't need to get your attention quite so dramatically.
Things can settle down. But you are gaining yourself in the process. It's tremendous to feel more real.
Yeah.
It's tremendous to recover yourself. And the funny part is, I was thinking about this today, so you begin to wake up out of your conditioning, right? And you start to see all the ways in which you were asleep and these patterns of inheritance or patterns of your life are kind of driving the bus, okay? And then you look back and you're ashamed of yourself.
Yeah.
Now, shame is a very deep-seated habit, and I do think that it's a energy and a frequency that can exist in the body, so it can often use multiple forms of support. But if we just looked at this for a second from like a higher view, it's almost like, I don't know, being ashamed when you're in the 12th grade that as a 6th grader,
right,
you didn't understand
that you were bad
how
at
to
writing
ask
essays.
Someone on a date. Yeah, exactly. Right? That you didn't know how to use the internet the same way. Or, so it's really funny because what's really happening is as you're waking up enough to look back and see the pattern, like, ooh, this was happening. It implies a level of maturation of self, evolution of self. And so it's like that one just knows better. Mm-hmm. But the one who did what you did or chose what you chose didn't.
Yeah.
And it just was really, we were doing the best we can. So it's this like really interesting thing where I'm like, why would we look back at the past and beat ourselves up? And I know you and I sit in positions of privilege because when you work with clients, when you have the honor of working with clients, like at this point, I don't know, I've been working with people for 20 years, right? You get to hear their stories, you get to see their journeys and see them evolve, as well as hours, right? We talk to each other and teachers and everything. But at this point, what I'm noticing is we just don't seem to get what it means to have a human body and live in a 3D reality with conditioning. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's that culture you were talking about, the instantaneous culture, but someone told us somewhere it was supposed to be easier. And I don't know, maybe it's just our memory of being one, maybe, with the divine at some point that's like, why is this happening like this? Yeah. But whatever it is, there is this respect and honoring of like, oh, right, of course I did that because I'm a human with this pattern. And a human with this, you and I have said this before, like I'm a human with this pattern and a human with this pattern does that. Yeah. But now I am waking up and my consciousness can drive the bus. And now that I can see it, I actually will have the free will to be able to choose differently, whether it's choose to act differently than before or choose to engage with the situation or myself differently, right? Choice can look a lot of different ways, but we get to be able to choose differently. And I was talking to one of our friends and I said something to him, when people talk about like aligned or like, am I aligned? I want to be aligned or I want to live from truth. And it sounds like a definitive statement.
Yes, like
there was before aligned and after aligned.
Yes.
Yeah. And I was like, I just always feel like we can get more and more free, more and more aligned, more and more true. And I was just sharing with him like how I experience it. And then he was like, oh my God, that's so liberating. And I was like, well, it turns out having that line in the sand apparently is very stressful for us.
Right. Because we're either the ones who achieved it or the ones who failed.
Exactly. And when you realize like, wow, okay, this is just the game of having a body in a 3D reality is that it comes with all sorts of conditioning and patterns. And, the battery runs low because you got a lot of shit running at the same time and you're not saying the truth. And the nervous system gets affected. Okay.
Right.
But I am the consciousness. And I can always find truth as truth is meant to be found. Mm-hmm. But at some point, when we have a soft enough approach and a compassionate enough heart and we're curious enough and devoted enough, we do seem to need to choose differently. Mm-hmm. Like that is what will come our way.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, because we've been talking about Adyashanti, I remember hearing him say somewhere, can't remember if it was a book or when we saw him in person, that when people experience what we would call awakening, for lack of a better word, have an experience of awakening, that it's nobody's ever like, that's exactly what I thought it was going to be. It's always, and we're talking about it as this ongoing incremental path, which in my experience is just how that shows up. That what we experience instead is way more simple. It's like, oh, I'm just supposed to be this one, right? Like this one having these experiences and seeing that the conditioning is not true, seeing that I'm not all alone in the universe, that I am life itself, right? So I don't mean to introduce this at like a tricky time right at the end of the episode, because I could say a lot more about what that means, but we're talking about one little slice of that, which is like, oh, go figure. I'm just the one whose consciousness is expanding in this body. Which means just like we know the universe is constantly expanding, there's no end line. I really don't believe there's any end to the amount that we can expand. And I'm really suspicious of teachers who say that they have gone to the finish line. Just like if somebody said to you, like, I finished the internet. I read all of the internet. It's like, really? I just feel like that's not true.
That's a good one.
So we're here to have an experience as an individual who is also the consciousness, and that has infinite expansion. Go figure. Way more simple than the stories I told myself, right, about
same.
What I would be on the other side of the finish line.
Same. And I think that's the thing to remember. If sometimes like when you hear people speak about these types of topics like we're speaking about now, you have to remember that there comes a point where you're ready for it to be like that. It's like, because we're gradually evolving, we're gradually maturing, and we're gradually increasing our capacity, and we're gradually finding more trust, and we're gradually learning more regulation, and we're gradually finding courage, right? So that when this came my way, it wasn't like I couldn't handle it. I could. It was the perfect cue up. I was the one who it should come to. Maybe Vanessa 5 years ago might have been different, right? And I mean, P.S., I was seeing this in a lot of different ways, and I just handled it very lacklusterly in the past. But, so it's like, if it sounds daunting or intimidating, because I remember when Adia was like, then just be honest. I was like, wait a minute.
There's going to be some consequences to that.
Yeah, because, Adia has the vibration, right? So those are fine words when we've had teachers say to us, truth heals and all of these different things about truth. And I'm like, yeah, truth is good. But when Adia said it, I felt it, and I felt what he meant. And that's very different than some nice idea about, I'll just tell the truth, or I'll be my truth. Because, you think your truth is different than it is. You think your truth is other than you. Turns out your truth includes a lot of your personality, too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right? It's just not including all of the delusions you've been holding on to about what the world means, like that meaning-making device. But anyway, so... yeah, that was shocking when he said it. And now I'm like, come at me. I'm ready. Like, I got this. This is okay. And that was a gradual trial and error, because, you dip your toe in and it turns out your toe doesn't freeze, and it's okay. And then, it feels kind of nice and tingly and cute. Right. And we keep evolving into that. So, this will be a conversation that either it's like perfect timing for you. You're right on the precipice of having to make a decision, and you kind of know what you want, but you've been super scared to admit it. And this will be a really beautiful invitation for you to choose differently with the consciousness that you are for your highest good, rather than what your patterns would tell you. Or you may not even be close to this yet. And this will just be a seed, but no big deal. You will be ready for this. And when you are, you will be the one who has all of the capacity to meet whatever that challenge is.
Mm-hmm. What did Adia say? You can feel scared and good at the same time.
You can feel scared and good at the same time. Thank you so much for listening to today's show. The show notes, including all the resources we mentioned, live on our website, blissandgrit.com. Our member platform is at patreon.com/blissandgrit. This is where you can head over and donate to the show to help us keep the topics rolling. You can also come hang out with us on social media. We are on Instagram and Facebook. Or go over to the website and subscribe to get our weekly digest of what resources we're currently loving. That's blissandgrit.com. We're so grateful for the reviews so many of you have written, for the membership that so many of you have provided, and for all the notes you send. We want to end it by sharing one testimonial from Deb Jones that came over Instagram to us. Deb said, "I love listening and so appreciate you both, really. My summer morning routine is a cup of coffee with an episode of Bliss and Grit. It's quite possible that I'm addicted." We love that. We love coffee. We love being a part of your morning, and we love all of you. Thank you all so much. Till next week.